Welcome back to For All Kerbalkind. Last episode, it seems like the Soviets are getting that much closer to putting things into orbit of the Earth, so we really need to double our efforts this year in 1954 to get to that point as well. Their rockets are a little bit more capable than us. They accepted the satellite contracts 3 months before we are going to immediately right now. So right now their program has had 3 months of a lot more KCT points than I have had. So we really got our work cut out for us. We probably could just accept both of these. They are going to remove all sounding rocket contracts, and we'll see what we'll have left for other things. So first, artificial satellite. We have 3 years, and this one 3 years to get all the things. The first scientific satellite contract, it requires the Geiger-Muller counter right here. So before we're able to do that contract within 3 years, we have to get at least through these, which shouldn't take a whole lot because look how much science we have. So let's just go into the mission control and do what I initially said I was going to do, accepting this contract because a lot of advancement funds. That was 100k advancement funds, but this one, first scientific satellite, that is 337 advance, 269 completion. We're already at 500,000 funds, and that is going to be absolutely phenomenal. The first thing we're going to do with those funds is to build a new launch pad here. It's going to be here. It's going to cost 70,000 funds, which, that's chump change now, right? Now for science, we have 38.5. So I'm almost thinking we go satellite era electronics research, early avionics probes, then satellite era science. We're going to go ahead and accept those in that order. So that's 10 there, 7 there, and 7 there. Okay, in the editor, we have a new engine we are going to be using, the NAA 75-110A series, which we are going to be attempting to develop a larger launch vehicle, or in this case, it would just be a missile. And it will develop its way into hopefully a launch vehicle for satellites very, very quickly. So let's see what we can do with this new engine. Here we have the speed build of Kedstone 1, which is very clearly a sort of Kerbal recreation of the Redstone missile, which is going to be used in this case not to its full potential. We can't quite get a large enough fuel tank to carry all the fuel this engine is capable of burning through because we are limited to 20 tons. So right now we are simply making a rocket that's about 20 tons capable of sending a small payload into a suborbital trajectory. And that small payload is going to develop its way into having a small creature on board and bringing them back alive. So we are going to create sort of a capsule design on top of this rocket here and send it up. We do in fact have contracts that we can accept and we can complete with this design. So I'm really hoping for the best. Now, despite how it's gonna end up looking here, we do not have heat shields yet. This is simply looking the part and aerodynamically being the part. It's completely designed for experimentation. February 4th, 1954. Midday, a K-43 is readied on the launch pad, marking the final flight of the K-4 series, aiming to once again photograph Brownsville from over 200 kilometers altitude. The mission is a complete success, marking a 100% success rate for the K-4 program. Let's do it. 3 upgrade points into the R&D. So we're at 28 for the R&D, and that brings our tech. Yeah, we're looking pretty good. If we can get to right here, we might be able to Triver orbit. Otherwise, it's gonna have to wait until next year because the other nodes here that will improve our chances are gonna take quite a while, as you can see. February 15th, 1954. Milton is tasked with sustaining supersonic speeds in the Cal X2. Specific parameters for the mission include speeds above 620 meters per second at roughly 13 kilometers altitude for a total of 3 minutes. Unfortunately, the aircraft isn't quite able to sustain these flight parameters for the duration, and Milton reports he would need about 1 minute's worth of extra fuel to complete this task. Throughout the 10.5-minute flight, no failures occur, and the Foundation is confident the vehicle's limitations have been fully brought into the light, ready to be improved upon with further iterations later in the year. Milton brings the aircraft safely to the runway, performing some last-second braking turns to bleed speed, and is congratulated on a successful flight upon recovery. The X2, as it is now, has seen its last flight and is quickly ready to be refitted for future missions. So, speaking of refitting for future missions, the comment section on last episode seemed to really like Longboy, even though I very clearly declared it was not an option. Well, it seems I have spoken too soon, because Longboy, with some redesigns, is in fact our next option. So we made the tanks longer, we are redesigning the tail fin a bit, instead of going for height, going for length. And we're also going to sort of sweep the wings ever so slightly. With this design, we are looking to be able to have a high speed for a much longer time, as well as to up stability and possibly less drag at said high speeds. Another new feature of the Longboy is an ejectable capsule in case of structural failure, because if Gerald had that option in his flight, he probably would have taken it out of protocol, but this is now the protocol now. So if we end up like breaking a wing and end up in a dead spin, instead of trying to limp back home and smash into the runway, we are simply going to eject from the vehicle. And I tested this in simulations. It does in fact work. Another feature of the Longboy is drop tanks, because if I wanted to put that fuel in the main fuselage, it would be even longer, and that would lead to instability and ridiculousness. And I'm a fan of ridiculousness, but we need it to actually work as well. So some of the fuel is being added into external tanks to be dropped off later, and this should honestly be able to complete the contract no problem. It might even be overkill, but that's that. April 6th, 1954. Peter is the first pilot to get a shot at flying the upgraded X2 aircraft, tasked with reaching the same parameters as the previous flight to better understand and analyze sustained supersonic flight in Earth's atmosphere. The new design features a swept wing, upgraded engines, a longer fuselage, and drop tanks in order to reach the desired speed and altitude for a duration of 3 minutes. Peter is dropped from his carrier aircraft over the Gulf and proceeds to complete the mission, cutting 4 of the 8 XLR-11 chambers to maintain speed. The aircraft holds stability at high and low speeds, and Peter is able to land at the KSC with no difficulty. The X2 is now a proven vehicle for supersonic flights, and will likely see more missions in the future. Every time you get 20 science in-game, it gives you a point. So as you collect science, you also further your program without having to dump funds into it. But we're gonna go ahead and, I believe, put another point in there. Both of these are going into R&D. So R&D points are at 30 now. VB is at 20, and we're in April of 1954. Taking a look at tech. Looks like we got 159 days until we have our the solids that I want to try to use for the first satellite. So that is really pushing the end of the year. It's likely we might get one shot at the end of the year. We might not. For contracts, we're able to do the next X-Plane supersonic flight for sure. I believe these parameters change every now and then, but I will be able to pretty much do what it's asking at this altitude and this speed. However, the more time between doing these contracts specifically, the more money we'll get out of it. So instead, we're going to do experimental rocket planes which we have 2 more contracts we can do. This is simply reach 20 kilometers at that speed. We'll be able to do that no problem. We can do that in our sleep, so we're going to accept that contract. And do notice we have 40k funds, so I'm going to get another point and slap that into R&D as well. April 27th, 1954. Eileen is next up for an X2 flight. An accepted contract for the Foundation is simply to further experimental rocket plane development by reaching 20 kilometers approaching Mach 2. However, the Foundation decides to take this as an opportunity to push the aircraft's limits in a safe manner. Eileen is given the option to determine the aircraft's top speed at 20 kilometers altitude with its current flight profile, which she agrees to accomplish. The flight is performed nominally, and Eileen reaches 1,510 meters per second before the fuel runs dry, about 200 kilometers downrange from being dropped from the carrier. The flight team below receives a generous sonic boom as the X-2 screams over the KSC, before Eileen carefully glides the rocket plane back to runway 27 and touches down, completing her mission and then some. As the years have gone on, the Astro Foundation has begun to spread its capabilities. It is clear the current Space Center is heading towards developing larger rockets, which take much more time and money than the small Corporal launches the program began with. However, the Foundation still sees the benefit of launching Sounding-class missiles using leftover technology from the military, furthering the scientific effort of space exploration. This, along with their desire not to hinder development leading to orbital-class launch vehicles in Brownsville, Texas, leads to the decision to begin funding a smaller space center on Wallops Island in Virginia. The new launch area will be dedicated to developing and launching much smaller, but no less important, rockets than in Texas, and work begins on this effort in late April 1954. Right, so the main purpose of this idea would be to fulfill some sounding rocket contracts while we wait for the satellite rockets to finish construction, and having it being built at a different facility won't slow down the construction of those larger rockets in order to do so. So this is sort of a way of getting a little bit more money while we wait for bigger rockets to complete, and that is so long as these rockets complete their missions successfully. Further down the line, I can see more uses for this, however. More than just sounding rockets, if we slowly put a little bit more and more money into it, the facility will be capable of building bigger rockets faster, and possibly even launch satellites into orbit, albeit smaller ones than the primary launch facility. But even so, I can see this further down the line being very useful. May 5th, 1954. The very first guided rocket of the program is readied on the launch pad in Brownsville. This mission is to be the first step on a long journey towards crewed spaceflight, testing a re-entry capsule design which is to be fitted for a small monkey once re-entry tests are complete. Optimistic about the design, the ground team watches as Keddstone 1 lifts off from the pad. The rocket burns through its propellant successfully, and just shy of T+2 minutes into the flight, stage separation occurs, and the to-be ride of a lifetime for a small critter is released to float through the vacuum of space and hopefully return to the Earth safe and sound, in so doing giving the go-ahead for a real flight. 10 minutes and 30 seconds later, communication is lost as the intense heat of atmospheric re-entry melts the capsule to oblivion. The cause for this is determined to be too steep of a suborbital trajectory for the poor capsule to withstand. It is also discovered that return aerodynamics are questionable at best, choosing more often than not in simulations to re-enter backwards. Work begins immediately, given what has been learned, towards changing the design of the capsule to improve survivability before a small creature will be allowed on board for a real mission. August 11th, 1954. The re-entry capsule designed for small critters receives some design changes to ensure survivability this time around. A second Kerbal 1 is ready to go. Its payload today is fruit flies once again, the main purpose being to determine just how safe the current mission profile will be for larger forms of life. Kerbal lifts off from Brownsville and is controlled to a 200-kilometer apogee over the Gulf of Mexico. 2 minutes into the flight, just past the Kármán line, the payload is jettisoned, left to re-enter the atmosphere. The onboard strobe lights flash in both visible and infrared light to ensure rapid recovery of the capsule once splashed down into the Gulf, as this is absolutely vital to the life of any creature on board, as well as to acquire the most accurate scientific data as possible. This mission ends as a complete success, acquiring 4.5 more science for the program's effort, and giving the green light to begin research with larger creatures. August 12th, 1954. The brand new launch facility in Wallops, Virginia sees its first flight today. A KBRM-1 lifts off over the Atlantic Ocean, intent on lifting classified payload for the US Air Force to 170 kilometers. Unfortunately, due to intense overburn being tested, the Airby engine shuts down with 3 seconds of fuel remaining. This brings the missile 5 kilometers short of its intended goal, therefore failing its mission. However, a new solid booster was successfully tested, as well as the capabilities of Wallops Island Launch Facility. Another flight is scheduled in just over a month to attempt the same goal, and work begins on altering the design slightly to increase performance. September 22nd, 1954. Just after sundown, Wallops launches a second KBRM missile, intent on again reaching 170 kilometers. This time with altered payload mass, less tilt on the pad, and slightly less overburn on the Airby main engine. Unfortunately, this time the engine cuts out with 12 seconds of fuel remaining, proving the risk overburn requires far outweighs any minor efficiency it could provide. The mission is once again failed, and the third KBRM-1 will be refitted to try again. November 6th, 1954. A third attempt at reaching 170 kilometers with 125 units of classified payload for the US Air Force atop a KBRM-1 missile is go. The missile lifts off from the pad, this time with hard limits on overburn. Successfully reaching 185 kilometers this time around, the mission is a success. Much to the surprise of the ground team at Wallops, the missile survives re-entry and splashes down into the Atlantic Ocean in one piece. The data collected from these flights will no doubt become useful for military applications. A few hours later, Milton gets his shot at flying the new X-2 aircraft on a much tamer flight than Eileen or Peters previously in the year. After getting to a speed of 500 to 600 meters per second at 13 kilometers altitude, the X-2 holds a minimal throttle for 3 more minutes, completing its mission successfully. Milton reports back to the KSC that only half of his fuel has been depleted. However, he could not burn the engines for much longer, or he'd risk overburn and possible malfunction. It is decided between Milton and Flight Control that he is to attempt to land the aircraft heavy, which is expected to be a difficult maneuver since more mass equates to a much higher stall speed. Milton approaches runway 27 with landing flaps fully deployed, banking side to side in an attempt to bleed off speed before touchdown. Any slower, and he risks diving nose first into the tarmac. After touching down, the aircraft tilts too far to the right, and, all too reminiscent of Gerald's final flight in the X-1, the aircraft disintegrates in a matter of seconds, killing Milton in the process. Had the aircraft been going 20 meters per second slower when the wing touched down, the landing would have been successful, and Milton would still be alive. Although the pilots understand the risk involved with pushing experimental aircraft to their limit, this event is met with protests and many news outlets calling the entire program's safety into question. Were the pilots in error, or were these aircraft destined to fail by design? The public wants answers, so therefore, new regulations are immediately put into place. All Foundation aircraft from here on out will require ability to land on at least 3 landing gear and withstand landing at high speeds in case of emergency. The safety of our pilots will stand as our #1 priority. Despite the terrible thing that has just occurred, the long wait for solid rocket boosters of the Baby Sergeant variant is over, which means we can push ahead and, on a much brighter tone, start work towards orbiting the Earth, which is no small feat in Realism Overhaul. We need about 9,600 to 700 meters per second of delta V. In order to do this, I am going with a method that sort of resembles the Redstone rocket. That much is of course obvious. Now, the most popular method of reaching orbit in Realism Overhaul is to use air bees, and more commonly referred to as space bees. This is something I do in my other series. This is something that's probably recommended and everyone does it. However, I am not using this air bee only because Beardy has refused to use the air bee because it is not, of course, Soviet technology. So if I was to use the air bee engine to get into orbit, I could have probably done it last year, and it would have just been, it would have been too overpowered. So I decided to wait for the technology and do it the good old-fashioned American way. I didn't go with a Vanguard rocket because that would have actually taken more time to unlock, because I wanted to get these solids out of the way because, well, solids, it's the American way. So anyways, it sort of resembles the Explorer satellite. However, I have chosen actually not to technically name this satellite quite yet. I kind of wanted to see if you guys had any recommendations for a satellite name. So if you have any ideas, drop them in the comments below. Otherwise, I may just call it the Explorer 1. Historically, that's what it would have been, and it pretty much resembles that. See here, we were doing a little bit of fairing magic to get a very lightweight cover over the section of the Redstone missile to the Baby Sergeant section, and we're putting in a small tank for RCS and reaction control thrusters because the payload is actually spin stabilized. So we now have a rocket capable of orbiting the Earth. All we have to do is wait for its construction to be complete. The construction of this was actually split up before and after the launch of our first creature into space because I needed a little bit more money to unlock the integral tanks because they are lighter than the separate structural tanks. So that may have slowed us down just a bit, but we are on track to put a satellite up at the beginning of 1955, almost 3 years before the real-life Explorer 1 satellite. I do know for a fact the Soviet Union's orbital capabilities is rearing its head as well, and the race is truly on to be the first to put a satellite in orbit of the Earth. Although by the time this rocket finishes construction, I believe that Beardy will have 1 or 2 shots at putting something into orbit as well. So it's not really looking all that likely, but we shall see what happens. November 14th, 1954. Another Kerbal 1 is readied on the launch pad to ensure the United States is the first nation to send a small creature into the unforgiving void of space and bring them back safe and sound. In the early morning, the missile lifts off from Brownsville, Texas, and carries the capsule up to 200 kilometers altitude with speeds exceeding 2,000 meters per second. The re-entry vehicle is then left to ballistically re-enter Earth's atmosphere, and using lessons learned on previous flights, is designed to flip 180 degrees once in dense enough atmospheric pressure so the parachute system successfully deploys, bringing the creature safely to the Gulf of Mexico for recovery and analysis. This mission goes off without a hitch and is considered a monumental step towards crewed spaceflight, but much is still to be learned about survivability outside of the atmosphere, and these small suborbital hops will continue to be small steps towards a much grander goal of space exploration. Foundation crews leave no time to waste and begin working on their most ambitious project to date, orbiting the Earth. December 20th, 1954. International news makes headlines across the globe. The Soviet Union has successfully placed the first satellite into orbit of the Earth with Sputnik 2. The news strikes a blow to the United States, as the Foundation was gearing up to be the first in this regard. Nevertheless, the race to space is on. December 25th, 1954. Christmas Day in Wallops, Virginia. The KBRM-1 missile sees its fourth launch, once again setting out to probe the upper atmosphere, carrying payload for the U.S. Air Force. Reaching the desired 210 kilometers downrange, the mission results in success. As the year comes to a close, the Astral Foundation pushes on through heavy blows to their morale. The loss of another pilot and the haunting reality of an artificial satellite owned by a potential enemy orbiting the Earth above their heads has really hit home. Work towards constructing a satellite of their own draw near to a close, with just over a month before its scheduled launch, and the people of the United States anxiously await for its arrival.
15 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire command. Fire command. Fuel tank pressurized. Block tank pressurized. Missile power. Ignition. Base tank. Lift off. Lift off.
February 3rd, 1955. Launch day has finally come. During the night, the Kerbal 2 launch vehicle is rolled out and readied for its debut flight. As sunlight slowly rises above Brownsville, Texas, everyone at the launch facility, from flight control to bystanders in the viewing area, can feel the electricity and suspension in the air. The question on everyone's mind is unanimous as the time to launch counts down to 0. Are we going to make it? The Kerbal 2 lifts off from the pad and arcs across the Gulf of Mexico. Its payload, a series of multi-stage solid rocket motors, are to propel the small satellite into orbit around the Earth. 2 minutes and 30 seconds into the flight, the first stage has successfully burned through its propellant, and shortly after breaching the Kármán line, the booster stages are detached from the Kerbal missile. Reaching an apogee of roughly 180 kilometers above the Earth, the final stages are spin stabilized using onboard helium firing from reaction control thrusters, and the 3 stages fire in quick succession. The United States has placed the small satellite into orbit of the Earth with an apogee of 2,220 kilometers and a perigee of 180 kilometers. Onboard electrical systems will keep the satellite alive for roughly 2 hours and 30 minutes, all the while communicating telemetry data with flight control when it passes overhead. Fluctuations could indicate small changes in gravity, the effect of radical temperatures outside of the atmosphere, or the presence of radiation altering instruments on board. Further study is deemed necessary, and the Foundation begins planning another Keystone launch. With our unnamed satellite in orbit of the Earth, that is going to wrap up episode 4 of For All Kerbalkind. Now, we already know that the Soviets did end up beating me to orbiting the Earth. Darn you, Beardy. And if you'd like to see how he pulled that off, a link to his video and his channel should be in the end screen as well as the description below. But anyways, I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and peace out.